Happy Thursday and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 918th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and today I have the huge pleasure and privilege of being your MC for a conversation featuring José Esparza Chong Cuy and Nile Greenberg. We're also thrilled to welcome poet Brittany Adames here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges that Black Lives Matter, and here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guest and host, José Esparza Chong Cuy is the Executive Director and Chief Curator of Storefront for Art and Architecture. Before his role at Storefront, José served as the Pamela Alper Associate Curator of the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago and as an Associate Curator at the Museo Jumex. In 2013, he was co-curator of the Lisbon Architecture Triennial, titled Close Closer. He is a graduate of Columbia University's MS in Critical, Curatorial, and Conceptual Practices in Architecture. And our host today is Nile Greenberg. Nile is a founding partner of NSE, a New York City based office that synthesizes structure, materials, cultural organizations, and media as architecture projects. Greenberg is the editor of the Brooklyn Rail's architecture section and is the co-author of the Advanced School of Collective Feeling and has taught as an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia University GSAP. Greenberg has worked at Moss Architects, Soil, and Liang in New York and Los Angeles. Thank you both so much for being here on the NSE today, and I'm thrilled to pass it over to you, Nile.
Hello, thank you so much for the invitation for both myself and Jose. I'm really excited to talk today about Storefront for Art and Architecture, something that is really close to many hearts of many architects in New York and is a really important institution that is being progressed by Jose, who in his 5 years so far has really done an incredible job with programming, with exhibitions. Like there's so much of different kind of attitude coming out of his tenure. So it's really been exciting. First of all, welcome, Jose.
Thank you. I don't know if I should jump in.
Yeah, I was hoping maybe you could give an introduction to the 41 years now of Storefront, and maybe you can give us a little bit of context about that.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you to everyone at the Brooklyn Rail. It's really wonderful to be able to join in this conversation with Nile. Thanks so much, Nile. It's kind of crazy now that you mentioned about the 40 years of Storefront, but also now that I've been at Storefront for 5 years, it's really kind of until very recently I kept saying that I had just moved here for this role, and it's kind of wild to think that to realize that it's going to be 5 years now in November. One second, I'm just gonna figure out my view. It's been it's really crazy to realize it's going to be 5 years now in November. And as many of you know, the last few years have really been kind of wild for everyone. I would say that running a small arts nonprofit has been particularly challenging. So it's been quite learning a very intense and interesting and unusual sort of like learning experience to try to understand the role of cultural organizations in New York during this moment. And I would say that there's something quite fascinating about storefronts that it just, even though it's been 40 years of storefronts, I think that the mission statement remains quite relevant to today, and it still resonates with a lot of the things that we experience in the city now. I joined Storefront, as you mentioned, 5 years ago, but it's actually kind of my second time at Storefront. My first interaction with Storefront was back in 2007, straight out of college. I studied architecture in Mexico, and I moved to New York pretty much right after graduating from college. And my first job was actually as an intern at Storefront. So I was kind of like in Storefront's orbit for around kind of like 3-4 years. Around that period, I lived in New York from 2007 through 2012 at the time, and interning at Storefront. I was interning at Storefront while I was working as a server a couple of blocks away at a restaurant called Epistrophe. And that sort of first interaction with a space that whose mission is to present work at the intersection of art and architecture, but also that sort of aims to present work that responds through an present artistic work that responds to the changes of the built environment through the work of artists and architects, was a really sort of eye-opening platform for me as a young sort of architect straight out of college. And it really kind of challenged my understanding of what not only architects could do and how they could practice, but also what exhibition spaces or culture organizations could do. So a lot of things happened between that time and now. And it's been really an interesting experience to think about Storefront's history and legacy in the last 40 years, and think of how we can incorporate some of those aspects of its history in our current program. So just for context, I know some of the images have been scrolling, but if you can maybe go to the previous image, Eleanor. So Storefront was actually first founded in 1982 at a tiny little storefront on Prince Street at 51 Prince Street. For those of you who know the neighborhood, it's exactly across the street from where McNally Jackson on Prince Street used to be. Now it's a kind of eyewear shop. But this tiny little storefront is where Kyung Park, along with Glenn Weiss and a lot of other artists and architects from downtown, were like started organizing exhibitions. I think the rent was maybe around $300 that Kyung paid out of pocket at the time. He was working as an architect, but doing this kind of like on the side. And I think that when they started Storefront, they never really imagined that it would continue to exist 40 years later. It was a very sort of, it was almost like a reactionary project, because at the time, or as they express it at the time, there wasn't a lot of spaces that were showing this type of work. I would argue that even today, to this day, there's still not a lot of spaces that show this type of work, but pretty much it was a space that sort of chronicled the changes of the built environment. You know, a lot of the exhibitions they were presenting at the time were very reactionary to things that were happening in the city. As you all know, New York City is a very different city from, like, the 1980s New York is a very different city from current day New York. That said, I think that there's still a lot of issues, a lot of social issues that are very present today, that we're still of very challenging issues at the time. And one Storefront has always been trying to address a lot of these transformations in the built environment through the work of artists and architects and exhibitions. This was at 51 Prince Street, and 5 years later, Storefront moved to our current venue, which is 97 Kenmare. And Storefront, mainly, from those of you who don't really know, is Storefront is mainly known for our facade, which was an artistic intervention by the architect Stephen Hull, who I believe was in the series a few weeks ago, and in collaboration with the artist Vito Conci. It's a long facade with 12 rotating panels that pivot on their own axis, that when they're open, they really kind of like blur the boundary between the inside and the outside, and where the kind of like inside almost like becomes the outside, and the outside we almost like treat it as a interior space as well. So we really think that the facade, which was commissioned in 1993, is somehow like very kind of poignantly articulates and it visualizes our mission statement. I saw in one of the comments, like, what are those issues? I think that from gentrification to issues around housing, to different challenges that happen in the city, I think that the exhibitions that we work on and that we present try to address these transformations in the city, and they're a wide range of issues, and we can maybe talk a little bit about some of the exhibitions that we're doing later on, but just to say that this space is where Storefront has been since 1987, and that's where we've been sort of presenting our exhibitions, but and programs that not only happen on the site, but we also kind of like host programs throughout the city, and have a wide range of projects as well. I don't know if that was a good kind of intro.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful. And I think I just want to like emphasize just how kind of relevant over the course of the last 40 years, like how much impact Storefront has had on the overall architecture and art community. You know, I think it's always been physically a very small institution, you know, but it's exaggerated and has a huge impact, I think, on a lot of people. I mean, do you think I think some of your projects so far have been, why don't we come back? I want to come back to some of the work you've done. I think it'd be nice to emphasize, I have like in preparation for this talk, I kind of went through some like of the Storefront archives, which are all available online in a really amazing format on archive.org. And there's just like an incredible amount of work and history there. And in preparation, I basically pulled up some, wow, these are amazing photos of like the old Storefront. But I think it might be nice to like kind of zoom through a few of these like history, just artifacts. And I recommend everyone like going through, and some great shows that they've had over the years. And maybe Jose, I don't know if you want to stop and comment on anything, or be curious like me.
Yeah, actually, the Storefront archive is actually quite fascinating, because it's been, again, it was kind of informally assembled when Storefront started, and now, I mean, we actually got a grant a few years ago to digitize most of the items in the archive, and that's why they're available on archive.org. We also have a physical archive that's accessible upon request, it was just few years ago, we organized, actually last September, we organized an exhibition for our 40th anniversary that we titled Public Space in a Private Time. That it took its name from an essay, from actually kind of like a manuscript we found on the in the archive of an essay by the artist Vito Conchi. He then published it, and it was actually quite a important piece of writing for Vito, but it was from 1991, and we found some fantastic sort of like images of Vito sort of workshopping that essay at the gallery at a public program in 1991. It happened during a series that was called Critical Issues of Art and Architecture, and one guest per month to kind of workshop ideas or present ideas information. And Vito had this, like, there was this really beautiful sort of like cue card with some bullet points that Vito wanted to discuss. And after that, like, eventually that became this essay that's called Public Space in a Private Time, which we found like it just like resonated so much with the way we're thinking about Storefront now, but also the way kind of like cities are experienced currently. And we used it as a way to present some of the work that Storefront had done in its early years. And basically that exhibition, which was primarily an archival show to celebrate Storefront's 40 years, was an opportunity for us to go through the history, but also kind of identify some of the key projects that were crucial in shaping Storefront's identity as a cultural organization in New York now. And out of these projects, many were, of course, surfaced, such as the image you're seeing now, which is a photograph of a piece by Diller Scofidio of an exhibition they presented at Storefront in 1987. It was one of Diller Scofidio's early exhibitions before they had any, I think it's before they had any built work at all. Now we all know them as a major architectural firm that has actually really radically transformed the way we experience New York City through their work at the High Line, at MoMA, at Lincoln Center, and many other kind of major projects. So, I mean, this is to say that a lot of these early sort of like radical ideas from architects were presented at, like, Storefront was kind of like an incubator for a lot of these ideas early on, for a lot of these practices, for people from Diller Scofidio, but also Charles Renfro, who then joined Diller Scofidio and Renfro. He also had his first exhibition at He participated in an exhibition titled Queer Space in the 1990s at Storefront, straight out of college also. So Storefront is this space to somehow present these ideas early on. But also, I guess, like Vito's one, I think the Storefront facade is probably one of Vito's, if not maybe his earliest sort of like architecture. As many of you know, Vito eventually moved on from his artistic practice and very much identified himself as an architect. And I think that I want to think that Storefront was kind of like a big player in that. And that piece, public artwork that Vito, along with Stephen Hole, did for the Storefront facade, I mean, I continue to be amazed by how amazing that installation is. I really want to think about it as a almost like a public art installation, even though it's in a private building. That's also kind of like a really interesting sort of like challenge or thing to think about, because it really feels like it should be something that has to be preserved. It's kind of like the staple of like downtown New York, but it is in a private building. But these issues about thinking about public art and publicness is something that is at the core of Storefront.
Yeah, I think,
Um,
I mean, I think that's like such a, it's, when I spoke with Stephen Hall, did an interview for the Brooklyn Rail in the current issue. We talked a lot about Storefront, and the irony is that, you know, it was meant to be temporary. You know, it was part of a series on the facade and doing these works, playing off the footprint of the building. And of course, it's become this thing that almost needs to be preserved. You know, and it's not just, you know, it's not just a private building, but it's kind of part of an institutional, part of this institution, which is Storefront. And one of the notable things I also came across in the archives is that there's like a spreadsheet of all the like commissioned works by Storefront, which I thought was very interesting. Like that, in a way, they have a collection like that could be reproduced, or, you know, not necessarily licensed, but, you know, share, you know, continued in a way. And there is a sort of series of works that were kind of for and by Storefront as like an institutional body. But I think, why don't we just go through a few more of these exhibitions? This is like, this is of course the original, the original design, which has these amazing super thin walls that hinge open. Maybe
I saw
Eleanor,
a
we can
question
just,
in the chat. How do they move? It's actually like a very simple system where you just, it has these hinges that you just push them open basically, and then you lock them in that, like, say, horizontal position. But it's actually like, yeah,
but
it's quite an interesting experience to see like a wall or like a facade dematerialize basically once you open it. Yeah, here you can
but
see
if you
it.
go like to that last image, Eleanor, like it actually took me years to realize this, that the shapes of the doors are not just compositional, they're in order to avoid structure and utilities inside the building. So here we have a sort of U-shaped door that when it rotates down has a notch that then can avoid the column directly behind it. So it's like a really brilliant, I really love how this had come together.
Yeah, and it's quite fascinating what you mentioned. I mean, also, I was kind of mind blown when I realized that the facade was meant to be, they were meant to change it every other year. Of course, it's
Right,
almost
exactly.
like, it was like too big of a project to take on. And we're actually quite happy that this project remained. And actually, like, an interesting thing that we've been doing lately is we almost like inviting, we started a program that we're calling Groundworks, that is kind of like an intervention on the facade or on the storefront building. And we're very intentionally calling it a public artwork. The first one in that series that we presented is with the Chicago-based artist Amanda Williams, who it's basically kind of like a conceptual mural piece that she did on the storefront facade. And maybe if you can go, Eleanor, to the first image of the slideshow. So this is how storefront currently looks. And Amanda intervened the facade, and it's been on view for over a year. The idea behind these sort of like commissions is that they're on view kind of like long term, as if it's kind of like a third voice added to that sort of like Vito and Stephen Hall collaboration, where we're also, this piece is called What Black Is This You Say? And Amanda, through her work on color, color theory and race, sort of is challenging notions of Black as a monolith. And we are presenting this piece on Storefront's exterior for an extended period, but it is also accompanied by sort of a big symposium that we organized at Cooper Union in collaboration with Cooper Union. And there's a forthcoming book that's coming also that's will be published by MIT Press. And this is kind of a new series that we're working on, where we're very intentionally calling these pieces public artworks. The forthcoming, so we're already working on the forthcoming commission with another artist who is intervening the facade. We're organizing a big symposium at Cooper again, and there will also be a publication that accompanies that big project. But the idea is to think of the facade, even though it's so it really helps us sort of articulate our mission, but also it's a big part of Storefront's identity. It is not a static thing that we, for us, it's very important to sort of think about it as something that can help us communicate to an even larger audience a lot of the things that we're thinking and working on at Storefront currently. And this project really kind of started during the pandemic, when we were closed for such an extended period. And we realized that we basically have pretty much a really big ground floor billboard at Storefront when the gallery is closed. And it's been really, really exciting to see how people engage with Amanda's work and how people engage with the work that's on view for an extended period. You know, even though you pass by there, someone can pass by there multiple times a year. Like you really get accustomed to something when you see it for an extended period.
Yeah, I really encourage everyone to see this work. It's really great. I mean, I've been walking past it, like you said, for years, and it slowly has grown on me, right? I mean, in a nice way, it's become familiar and recognizable, which is really nice. I mean, do you want to, like, there's some really interesting work you've done beyond this piece. I think in particular, I thought there was some great shows from Christian Niampeta, A Long Evening, that was in 2021. I absolutely loved the show by Miguel Fernandez de Castro and Natalie Mendoza, The Absolute Restoration of All Things. That was a stunning show, and their work is quite brilliant. It was about a recovered gold mine. I want to make sure the details are right, but it was kind of evaluating the restoration of what was a gold mine in Mexico.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's been. Go ahead, Niall.
Yeah, no, and then I think, yeah, like you kind of touched on public space in a private time, but I thought, what has your kind of attitude under your direction been? Like, what kind of artists are you interested in bringing in? What's your kind of perspective on Storefront now?
No, it's been. Thanks for bringing those up. It's actually been like I don't know. It's very intentional the way we organize exhibitions, and it might not seem like that it might not seem like that from the outside, but the way we think about the program has been very intentional. And when I first joined Storefront, we basically programmed a few exhibitions that were kind of almost like testing a little bit like what worked and what didn't work. And the first set of I guess like 5 shows I worked on before the pandemic, or 4 shows I worked on before the pandemic, were very intentionally referencing a previous, I would say, like a typology of an exhibition that Storefront had organized in the past. So as before starting to make invitations for exhibitions, I really looked at the history of exhibitions that Storefront had done, and there was like the I guess like the more kind of community engaged type of exhibition with a, I don't know, like a collective. There was like the more intentionally architectural show that's like a pairing between an architect and an artist. There was a more sort of research-based exhibition project that we worked on. And so over the first year, I would say that before I arrived, I was really thinking about those typologies of exhibitions and trying to understand how they resonated with like the storefront audience. Of course, that pandemic dramatically shifted that sort of, it interrupted that sort of a year of experimenting with these sort of exhibitions. But it really was we learned a lot in that process. And the first exhibition that we organized as part of the program when I joined was with a collective from San Juan, Puerto Rico, called Brigada Puerta de Tierra. That exhibition, which translates to like Puerta de Tierra Brigade. Puerta de Tierra is a neighborhood in Old San Juan in Puerto Rico. And this collective had been doing a lot of activism in their neighborhood that was like resisting very harsh and visible sort of gentrification process that was happening. There was a lot of like very intense displacement of the community, the local community of Puerta de Tierra, and they started organizing themselves, doing a lot of basically like taking over or cleaning up like all abandoned sites and like really kind of like starting to take a lot of ownership in their neighborhood in a much more sort of visible and activist way. And in that process, when I started working with them, they were working towards establishing a museum of history and community in the neighborhood at an abandoned building in their neighborhood. But they didn't really have access to that building. And when we started working together, it was immediately we realized that it could be an interesting opportunity to use the invitation at Storefront as a space to present what that museum could look like and what type of objects that museum could hold, which was mostly just sort of like objects from the neighbors in Puerta de Tierra, from like records to different sort of mostly they were also kind of collecting a narrated account of the histories of the people that had lived there. The exhibition was actually titled Aquí Vive Gente, which translates to People Live Here. It was a really, I think, exciting, at least for me, to see how we could use Storefront as this space that could kind of like host these stories, and in collaboration with them sort of use Storefront as a platform to begin what could potentially be kind of like a new institution. And we very intentionally framed it as if like the Museum of History and Community of Puerta de Tierra presented its first public iteration at Storefront. So as part of our invitation, they designed a logo for their museum. They wrote a mission statement for their museum. They started thinking about like what the collection could incorporate. And that project was I don't know, I thought it was a very successful project in the sense that it really translated a lot of how I understand Storefront, but it really resonated with a lot of previous projects that Storefront had organized in the past.
So do you know what happened with the group over time? Were they ever able to sort of establish a more, I mean, it's an amazing project. I didn't know that about that work.
Yeah, we did like a ribbon cutting at Storefront. They like marched with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez during the Puerto Rican Day Parade here, using like the banners they designed at Storefront. It was actually like, it was fantastic. They're still together. It was also very teen focused, like youth focused. And so a lot of the kids now are 5 years later, basically. They're now older, they're still involved, and they're still kind of trying to get a space from the city to establish that, like find a permanent home for their museum. But the way we kind of like framed it when we were working together is that like the museum would remain as like almost like an itinerary museum, like a traveling museum, until it goes back to its home, until it can get a permanent home in Puerta de Tierra. And so that
That's
was
great.
that was a really
Yeah.
it was a really interesting model. And then we, for example, like did a 2-person show with an artist and an architect where we paired them. That was a very different approach. It was more of a kind of like a site-specific installation that they worked on. Or Christian and Perez exhibition, which was a more sort of experiential or meditative or contemplative show where music was a big component. That was also kind of presented as we were opening up again after, like, during the pandemic. So it was kind of very fitting for that moment. And recently, we've been working with kind of a year-long themed model. That's been a very interesting experience. That actually, like that year-long kind of themed program, followed the 40th anniversary archive exhibition. So we're currently calling that program that program is called On the Ground, where we're basically kind of, it's a year-long study of like New York City's like ground floor or storefronts, and how storefronts basically really thinking about storefronts as spaces that really can become anchors in someone's own community, and how people engage with these different sort of like storefronts that are these thresholds between these like public and private space in New York City's ground floor. So through that, we kind of like launched this year-long theme back in February, and we're closing it in this upcoming February. And in that, we're doing a series of exhibitions. But we also we did an exhibition. The first exhibition was with a collective from New York called Canal Street Research Association, and they anchored their project on a building called New Lamp Plaza, a mini mall on Canal Street and Center Street. And then that was followed by an exhibition of the Chilean artist Francisca Benitez, who anchored her work on a lot of the activism that she does and the work that she does with the Stop Shopping Choir. That they have a space that they call the Earth Church on Avenue C and in the Lower East Side, in the East Village. And we currently just opened an exhibition with a Brooklyn-based artist, Ilana Harris Babu, that is very much focused in her experience growing up in Prospect Efforts in Brooklyn. And it's almost kind of like an homage to that neighborhood that's changing so dramatically. Alongside these exhibitions, we're also doing a lot of public programs that are researching through different ways this notion of the ground floor of New York City. But we also did a series of radio shows that we're doing in collaboration with a New York-based independent radio project called Montes Press Radio. We're also launching a reader at the end of the year that expands on these issues, and we invite other artists and other architects to participate in all of these projects. So it's been interesting to think of this kind of like year-long curatorial model that allows us to continue researching these subjects beyond the like 3 months of an exhibition.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah, I
that's
think
been
a lot of
particularly interesting with your model has been so much about these overlapping and this continuity between different shows that are superimposed over each other. Like the facade is always there, and then there's an exhibition, and then there's a series of events that punctuate it. I think it's been like a really great way of working and exciting, and like in pursuing like the storefronts. It's not nostalgic. I think it's time. It's pursuing the. I was gonna say pursuing the kind of storefront mission, which has been like always about a kind of porosity and openness to kind of the ongoing kind of city issues, which I think you brought up at the beginning, or this idea of like tackling the issues of the city. And I think it's been like a really nice process. I think I was thinking while we were talking, or while you were talking about, you mentioned like that storefront, has kind of been an incubator. And I was thinking, oh, it's funny that, you were even like storefront was even an incubator for another institution, like it's kind of like,
yeah.
Now it's even incubating new institutions, which is like an incredible progression of this idea. And I was thinking, a typical museum, this is not quite a museum, but a typical museum basically is, would be called, it's sort of a vitrine. It's kind of airless room, a airless glass room. And whereas I feel like an incubator, one that you might have a baby in or grow mold, is almost the exact same physically, except that it's porous, right? It's letting air in to the glass case. And I was thinking as a metaphor, like as an incubator, it's actually very prescient against the idea of a vitrine, and really why storefront success is like through growth, right? Through constantly kind of evolving, and its porosity is giving, everything inside an opportunity to grow, not an opportunity to be preserved in eternity, right? And I think that's is just like really nice to see how you're kind of tackling that mission. But I thought, the on the ground endeavor has been going on, and it's good. It's great that you can touch on that. Do you think? So it's been, and then do you think there's an open call as well, right? Which I thought was an interesting note from something we don't see that much anymore, right?
Yeah, as part of we also, as part of this year, we also launched an open call that responds to this notion of the storefront as sort of a typology in the built environment, like in the city, and this notion of like the ground floor spaces. So we launched an open call that responded to that theme. And that's going to be an exhibition that's going to be presented in mid-January next year, and that's going to close sort of our year of on. We're announcing soon who was selected, but actually, like during the jury process, there was a really great jury that we invited for that. It was quite fascinating to hear. We didn't really participate in the jury. We mostly just managed the project. We launched the open call in collaboration with Freeze magazine, and it was really fascinating to hear the jury talk about storefronts and what they thought, what type of projects made more sense with storefronts identity in a way. And I guess you'll hear about who was selected, or which project was selected soon. But yeah, I guess it's always really nice to hear someone else talk about what they think makes sense at storefronts. And I want to say that they really got it right. But we're very excited to work on that project soon.
Yeah.
Or to announce that project soon.
Yeah, that's very exciting. And it reminded me in doing this research, maybe if we can go back in the slideshow to the kind of queer spaces show, one of the amazing products from that show in 1994 is this compendium, which I've included a few thumbnails, like these grids of thumbnails, but it's like a 400-page manifesto, which is essentially compiled with like 100, or I don't know exactly how many, but it seems like hundreds of kind of individual proposals for this kind of redefinition of like, or definition at that time of like what a queer space might mean, and these different interpretations and stories and poetry, narratives, advertisements, like an incredible amount of different approaches. And I think that gets to your point, right? It's like everyone has this relationship with Storefront, and it's like they all have some amount of projection of what they believe its utility is, or its mission, or its what is relevant to it. And I think it's because there's so many things that have been meaningful to people there. So I think, like, you know, I was excited to see an open call in that it was like this kind of collective opportunity for a lot of people to kind of zero in on what they think, you know, was appropriate based on your guys's brief, you know, which is kind of what is the ground floor, what is the city today. And I think it's asking what is relevant in New York or elsewhere or in any city today is like such a intense question. Like, it's still such a problem. Like, I mean, in many ways, things have really gotten worse, and like affordability, and there's so many things going on. And I think it's great that Storefront is like trying to tackle this kind of ground floor question, right? Because I think there's been a lot of research on this, and people kind of trying to get to the meaning of the vacancy in New York, right? And what's taking a lot of these spaces. I mean, you know, it used to be that we were afraid of big box stores getting rid of retail, and now those are gone too. It's like you know, it's the ground floor is like is almost like it's a newly relevant, you know, post-COVID especially. So I really look forward to that exhibition.
And it was actually quite the open call really came, we kind of like weaved it into this year's program after working on the anniversary exhibition, the archive show, as you very kind of rightfully point out, the queer space exhibition, and how there was a lot of voices included in that show through this publication. That was kind of like an open submission for manifestos of what constituted a queer space. And it was very clear to us in working in going through the archive that the curatorial model of the open call, or the sort of submission-based exhibitions, was very important to Storefront's identity as well. It was like really, really, there's a lot of really great shows that were presented at Storefront through this model of the open call. And we wanted to kind of like rethink it, do it in a way where the project that was selected had enough resources to be presented properly, that they had an artist fee. So this is something that we've been working through also at Storefront internally. How can the projects be and the artists that work on them be better compensated? So this as much we would love to do so many things. Like there was a lot of projects that we would have loved that made sense for the open call for us to take on, but also doing it in partnership with a major media publication that could give visibility to the project was an important step for us. So it's like understanding that the open call is a important model in Storefront's history. It was our takeaway from going through the archive and presenting that anniversary exhibition, and then thinking about how we can do that in a way that's right now is something that it's what I guess it's like what's exciting about like working at a cultural organization of this scale. We're a small team, and we have a small exhibition space, but we have a lot of there's a lot of ideas and a lot of sort of interest in doing more and fun things, but I just want to do it right.
Yeah, I really appreciate like you tackling because underlying what you're saying is there's a kind of history of kind of competitions in architecture being a kind of exploitative practice and also resulting in potentially underfunded works, you know, and I really like that you're kind of trying to address it while still maintaining the idea, which I think it's very productive, obviously, you know, for everyone to be able to contribute. I thought maybe we could speak broadly in our remaining minutes about kind of your perspective on the kind of relevancy of architecture and art exhibitions as a whole. I thought maybe, you know, there is, you know, we're about, I think like 10 years ago, there was a sort of series of blockbuster architecture shows, you know, MoMA PS1 had their kind of annual architecture project, Young Architects program, which was a kind of, you know, milestone marker for a lot of architects in New York. And there was a lot of like huge amount of changes. And now, you know, MoMA has, for instance, has absorbed the architecture department into the art and kind of created a more fluid, less medium specific role. And I think there's been a lot of changes in what it means to exhibit art. I mean, the Venice biennials look far different than they did, not far different, but, you know, there's just a different tide coming in maybe. And I think like, it's exciting to see your contribution to that. I wonder as a whole, like if you think, what do you think of like the relevancy and the relationship of architecture and exhibitions might be?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, but also, I don't know, reason why I'm interested in a space like Storefront and why exhibition resonates so much with me is because I think it's not about like, it's not about the discipline. It's not like a disciplinary, we're not advancing the discipline of architecture. It's also not only about architecture, and I think that that's something that I guess Storefront has had its different moments in its 40-year history, and it's been very closely aligned with the discipline of architecture in certain moments, and that's been great. But I think that's something that we've been trying to focus on is to almost like reconnect with its multidisciplinary sort of, or not actually not multidisciplinary, because I don't think it really is about like any discipline, like art as a discipline or architecture as a discipline. I think it's this intersectional space where we work with artists, architects, or whoever has good ideas that's thinking about kind of social situations that emerge from the places we live in and we inhabit. And I think that that's how I like to think about like quote unquote architecture exhibitions. The best quote unquote architecture exhibitions, not the best, but like architecture exhibitions that resonate with me are those that are about the, I guess like the lived that can share about like the lived experiences and like the impact it has in the lives of the people around it, around these spaces. And in that sense, there of course is a space, and I would say a need also for more disciplinary focused exhibitions at big museums. There's advancing the research on certain practices, giving visibility to under-recognized architects that have had major impacts in the spaces where they work, but that because of our sort of Western focused sort of history, there hasn't been space for that. But I think that it's interesting to see museums tackle other practices through that sort of academic lens. And yeah, I think there's space for all that. I think that Storefront is a space for something different. And I don't think of the work that we do necessarily as if they're like architecture exhibitions or not. It's almost like not a concern that we have. I think they very much are about the city, or whether it's like the city or a rural space, or as you said, like a mine in Mexico. They like all of the work that we've presented, in my opinion, has in one way or another tries to tell a story of how people's lives are impacted by that social situation. And that for me is what architecture should be thinking about, when whether it's designing a building or thinking about a master plan, or yeah, thinking about what materials you're using for that building, the impact this has on people's lives is, I think, what's important for me.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you for that. I mean, that's a really insightful conversation. I mean, I do think the definition of architecture, you're almost saying, well, not even of architecture, but of the architecture that's most interesting to you is this idea of like social situations, right? That anything that kind of organizes a situation is considered architecture, right? And the kind of materials that got there, right? And
we're actually like
trying the new social environment, which is I think the title of these series. So
yeah, and we're actually like trying to get away a little bit from the concept of architecture because it's so limiting. And whereas like art, for example, is like so broad, no? But we're using more like the concept of the built environment, which I also think find it very limiting, because it's not really only like the like whatever's built. Like I always say, like the built and sort of like rural spaces are also something that we're concerned with. It's like, or I guess like anyway, the limits of language.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's why we have other mediums, right? To explain the gap in language, right? And I think that's what a lot of these shows have given us. But I think we're basically up for the talk. I think that's a good place to leave it, right? And then maybe there's some Q&A. I think, Eleanor?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you so much, Jose and Nile. That was a really incredible and insightful conversation. Yeah, there's so much to think about. So thank you so much. We've got a few questions today, and if anybody in the audience would like to ask a question, please do raise your hand or send a message in the Zoom chat. Our first question today will be from GE. GE, you should be able to go ahead and unmute.
Thank you so very much, Eleanor. Congratulations to the rail for adding this new section. And thank you, Niall and Jose. Can you speak a bit about how POPs, the privately owned public spaces, about how their consequences of multiplications and the expansions affect like everything from personal psyches to even our abilities to protest?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I don't know if you have anything to say about that, Niall, but it's certainly an issue that it's something that's very much up Storefront's alley, and it's something that we'd love to explore through an exhibition or not. Actually, the show we just had this summer with the artist Francisca Benitez very much try to focus on some of these spaces through her artistic practice. She had this like beautiful piece at the gallery that was a kind of like a floor rubbing. She does these like floor rubbings on, but she's been trying to kind of like register a lot of these like pop spaces, and she had this really kind of large scale piece of the steps of Sukati Park. She was very heavily involved in the Occupy Wall Street movement at the time, and I wanted to kind of like capture these steps through this artwork. She had a bunch of other, she has this kind of like long, big archive of just like copying these spaces and tracing them into a piece of paper through her, it's a very performative act in a way. But other than, I would say that Storefront hasn't really worked on an exhibition specifically about that, but maybe that's something that we could pursue in the future. It's certainly
Yeah,
it's very aligned with our mission.
I do feel like, I think Canal Street Research has also done some kind of essayistic work on these kind of triangles, right? That have
yeah.
But I don't know. I don't think it's explicitly the sort of zoning business model of POPs, which is like a kind of citywide kind of zoning methodology to build taller buildings, right?
But it certainly really affects like the I really liked how he framed it as like something that like affects the psyche also, because like it looks
completely,
but it's not.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably a lot to tackle in it. But it does feel like so Storefront, which, yeah.
Thank you for that question, GE, and thank you for the responses. Our next question will be from Chloe.
Thank you so much, Nile and Jose, for this incredibly insightful conversation. Jose, I was wondering if you could talk about Storefront's role in publishing, especially books on architecture, art, and design. For example, the newsprints book behind you was a really fascinating collaboration and project, and I'd love to hear about the role of publishing in furthering Storefront's work as a cultivator of community conversation, both locally but also internationally over the years.
Well, that's a great question. I would say that Storefront's like role in publishing happened in a very informal way. Again, like the whole Storefront project was slowly formalized over the passing of years, and until very recently, I feel like we all felt very uncomfortable calling it an institution, but like I think it's time and it's important to think about it as an institution, because calling it an institution somehow helps us think about Storefront's longevity and relevance. So I think that I'm at a moment where I feel comfortable enough to call it an institution. But just to go back to your question, I think that its venture into publishing was mostly through kind of like mail outs and small flyers that the Storefront team was assembling back in the 80s. And there was always like some printed materials and ephemera that was done for each exhibition. A lot of that is what's in our archive. And actually, when I was an intern is when this book was published. And it's actually it's a 2-volume publication that goes from, it's basically all the Storefront newsprints that were published and mailed out from 1982 through, it's 2 volumes, from 1982 through 2009. And it basically just it's a reprint. It's like we've scanned all of these these posters that were mailed out, and we basically just compiled all of them, and it's almost like an exhibition history and archive of all of the Storefront shows. This is actually kind of like it's very kind of like low printing quality. It's printed on a newsprint also, which is how we continue to do. We do one of these newsprints for each exhibition, and we continue to do that. We've slowly over the course of the years, like that, it was standardized into like one size and a certain series of folds. But when it first started, they were more like kind of like postcards. Let me see if I can find. It had like different sort of like types of invitations for the exhibitions. And
Niles
it's actually
got one too.
Oh, so that's for the recent exhibition that we just opened.
Oh, cool.
And there's like you can find a lot of information in these like newsprint sheets. So that's kind of like how Storefront started getting into publishing. I would say like publishing in a more informal way, but I do think about it as a publishing sort of like strategy. And we think about the newsprint is kind of like an important aspect for each exhibition. We work with the artists very closely and like what type of content they want to include, but it also has a lot of information about like the board, the team, what grants we got that year. And like when you look at like the 40-year history of that, you can find out like there's a lot of information in these. And I remember as I was like working on, because I was photographing and scanning these back in 2008 when I was an intern, and I was just like fascinated by seeing like all these people that had passed through Storefront, you know, from like the exhibit, like coming across like the Dan Graham exhibition in the 80s, but also realizing that like David Hammonds sat on the board for 5 years at Storefront, that Namjoon Paik was on the board as well. There's actually like a print by Namjoon Paik also in the archive. Yeah, they contain a lot of history. So that's one aspect into publishing. Storefront in its more recent, I guess like as in the last 40 years, publishing has become a different thing also. Storefront has published kind of like major books in the past, from to mention one is a big 3-volume publication project called Office US that was done for Storefronts. Storefront was actually the commissioner of the Venice Architecture Biennial. This was when the director Eva Frank was as director a few years ago. And that was a major sort of like publication endeavor, 3 huge volumes. Currently, since I've been at Storefront, we haven't published a lot of other than the newsprints. We haven't gotten into the publishing world. We've just we're currently working on a series of books, and we're launching the series with MIT Press and Amanda Williams next year. And we've already kind of like have 3 more in the pipeline that we're working with them. And then we're about to start a new series of more kind of like chapbooks. And we're currently working also on a kind of a history of Storefront publication. That's kind of pretty much going to be what the work that we did for the Public Space in a Private Time exhibition. So that's another kind of like major publication where a lot of the archival material will be reprinted and included in the book.
That's so exciting. Thank you so much for that incredibly generous and great answer to my question. I'll pass it back over to Eleanor.
Thank you, Chloe. That was a really awesome question. Thank you for that amazing response, Jose. I just want to ask one final question before we turn to poetry. Jose, I was wondering if you could speak a little more about how your previous experience and background in the art world and as a curator influences your position now at Storefront, and maybe what you brought or what you left behind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the question. it's funny because yeah, I mean, I was mostly in school. I mostly focused in architecture, so I studied architecture in Mexico, and then moved to New York. And I kind of like soon after encountered with Storefront, which kind of like was a very important school for me, actually. Like just in thinking about like how the type of work that like that discipline could really be very expansive. And this is funny, and the team here always laughs that I always bring this up. Um, but I think that a very formative experience for me as a curator was actually working as a server at a restaurant in New York. That I think that that's something that it just like really you have to work very fast, develop a lot of certain social skills that I think that curators now have to sort of like focus on, because we work on a broad range of aspects, from engaging with your board, but also like being at the gallery and just engaging with the people that walk in, and anyway, that I always think of that as a very formative experience for me as a curator. But I would say that my experience as a curator in the like more traditional spaces of art and working in museums was very important also. So after my time in New York, the first time, I moved back to Mexico, and I was working at the Museo Jumex in Mexico City, which was it was a museum that was about to open its doors in a new building by the architect David Chipperfield. So it was this kind of like incredibly well-funded museum that had a really exciting new team that was thinking together about how like trying to give an identity to that museum that was like just opening its doors. That before that it was mainly a private collection that sometimes organized shows like in the outskirts of the city. But when I joined the team, it was having this big moment, and I guess that was a very formative experience with me. And even though I had a more junior position, seeing the way the team thought about what that museum could look like, not physically, but like what type of tone that museum should have, and just like being in those conversations was a very important experience for me. And we were kind of testing things out because this kind of team opened the doors of the museum, and it's actually now going to be 10 years. It's 10-year anniversary now, actually. Yeah, that was very important for me to kind of like think of all aspects of what it means to work in a show. And then when I moved to Chicago, I was in a more traditional sort of like curatorial department, where I was also thinking about collection shows, but also I really kind of understood my role within that as a curator from Mexico, who kind of like trying to think, looking at like the exhibitions calendar, say, of like the museum's upcoming years, and thinking about trying to think very responsibly, at least in my mind, of what voices could like what artistic voices could complement like that large spectrum. Like I think that working in bigger museums made me very conscious of like how institutions are presented publicly or to its audiences, and that's something that I think I try to be very mindful here at Storefront when we design the program, and when we think about the projects we'll be doing in the future. Yeah, I don't know if that made sense.
Yeah, that's really
But yes,
cool.
I see in the comments hospitality. Yeah, hospitality was very important for me.
Yeah.
And I'm a waiter at heart.
I think it's time to open a restaurant at Storefront. You know?
Exactly.
Yes.
Prime
And
Hey.
Poncho added in the chat as well, if you could kind of speak a little bit to your vision for Storefront, in kind of as an extension of the previous question.
Mhm. Well, I would say that the vision is very much articulated through the shows that we're doing. And I would say that it's very much connected to,
Oh, sorry, Jose. Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm really sorry to interrupt you because I know you're going exactly into the answer of my question. But my question was a little bit about that I'm very curious is about that vision that you brought when you arrived, let's say 5 years ago. And I think we have this privilege to see you 5 years later after this pandemic and how that vision changed or expanded, or, I'm super curious about that because I'm sure that you had some plans. Those plans, I'm sure it changed and how that transformed. I'll be very curious if you would kind to share. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thanks for the question, Pancho. I would say that yeah, I think that I would maybe go back to Niall's question on my understanding of like architecture, and I think that idea of thinking about a space like Storefront as a platform to present work that responds to like more like social environments, and how artists can create work that helps us think more expansively about those things and with less restrictions on like, is that architecture, is that not architecture, or is that art or is that not art. I think that that's a very unique condition that a space like Storefront has, and I can't think of other institutions that have that like really almost, I don't know, it really doesn't feel like, and this is why also I kind of like resist the concept of the institution. It doesn't feel like an institution, but even though I'm like now calling it an institution, but I think yeah, I think that seeing how the program has resonated with a growing audience is something that I'm very excited about, and yeah, it's certainly a privilege to be able to be here for the last 5 years, and particularly because of how complicated it's been. But I think that I would say that it's almost like only in the last year that that vision I had for Storefront has like finally kind of taken its own kind of like, I don't know, form and shape, and I'm excited for the years to follow. Hopefully there won't be another pandemic. But yeah, I think that I'm really excited also about the potential of these long-term curatorial models. I think that they allow for more research, but also to kind of accompany an artist's work for a longer period of time. I think that the sort of 3-month pop-up show model is I'm nothing against it, but it's complicated, and like I think that we're trying to find ways of how to establish relationships that are a little bit more long-term, and to be able to do also like more research internally, but also to invite others to do research on these subjects, and to have more time to share it more publicly. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Amazing. Thank you so much for adding that question in. That was really a great one. And thank you for that wonderful response, Jose. Thanks again to Nile for the questions as well and for working on the slideshow. We have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding our events with a poetry reading, and today I'm so thrilled to welcome our Poet Laureate of the Day, Brittany Adames, to the stage. Brittany Adames is a Dominican-American writer. Her work has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and featured in Palette Poetry, Up the Staircase Quarterly, and elsewhere. She has an MFA in poetry from Brooklyn College and is an assistant editor at Simon & Schuster. Thank you so much, Brittany, for being here.
Thank you. And thank you, Nile and Jose. I will be reading 3 poems, the first titled Museum Girl. What my lover at the market didn't know was that I'm at stakes with myself or I'm with nobody. At 9, I thumbed at the model of blood clot between my legs, my mother telling me the toallitas are the best. They don't hurt the way tampones do, all bonded by a divine and crucial lack. Nestled right in the area where the pretty meets its eye. I use it as allegory for when I'm 17, body a cling to the stilted tank where I'm standing or knelt atop a bus station in mid-February where a boy, this walled thing of his own, sets his lip together. And I try to sober him the best I can, but I'm dulled to the intrigue. I can imagine it now, his cracked palm roughed on an elevator door, where I think I quiver, and I think I try to conjure an image of the downtown river winding its way east, where a specific crack against the bridge. And that boy, he turns to me then, wind-beaten lip flesh rabid against his braces. He turns and shoots a glob of spit onto the concrete, where the cold wishes it away, and he tries to catch my eye, this boy. And later, I'm standing above my mother's thinning gray hair, belly ballooned with longing that lasts, where she sees I've come home after meeting with the good-natured boy for the first time in a long while. And she belts when she asks, "See, that didn't hurt, did it?" And I'll torture a smile on my face, will it to break, and say no, not at all. When I dissociated in Walmart, I lost my fucking mind. Body all white bone, but not once did I believe it. Each pathetic breath dreaming with the tangled shrubs. Soon I was prying at the undergrowth, and in this numbness, the boy I hate to love cushioned me in emotion that felt as real as the world slipping from my mouth. With every given heave comes a reality boxed firmly inside fear. I pray the urgency makes this into a dream state. Outside, I signal the cigarette destitute, enough to let it become the spectacular fact between love and worship. Somewhere we a tragedy to someone. Somewhere we the threadbare cloth made from an anatomic location. The time we died, the morning had hardly settled unto itself. I can't explain it anymore. Temporalities of the clergy. Reader, I worked hard to immortalize the ash before it hits the tray. Reader, I've made sure I'm daughter to the noise, the mother fastened to the hospital cot, father's injuries sustained while drunk, brother's marijuana court case, and the Jesus fucking Christ, what can I craft the aftermath with? Reader, I feel like a failure. Failure is good. Failure is right. Failure is part of the fiction. I fail faithfully. Mother slowly wakes in the operating room, says, "God, please forgive me, but I have to eat meat today." Reader, the linear progression of past, present, and future begins in the uterus, producing abnormal vaginal bleeding. Doctors don't know what caused this, but removing the uterus surgically will make me believe in God again. Reader, do you have a light? Reader, I'm drowning in my nowness. I'm standing up again to smooth the dynamic cushion on the herida. Mother swivels in her fat. Father's blood pressure rises to 160 and he's pacing again. Reader, you have no idea where I'm coming from. I'm coming to you as a monetary value, representing wealth spanning one generation to the next. I'm rich. I can imagine materialism at the cost of any self-made baron, generational wealth, generational farm to table, generational consequence, generational cleavage, generational bed, generational death. Reader, there's a bit of drainage congealing at the end of the breath. Reader, the gauze is hardly holding. Reader, I want to metastasize myself. Reader, Eve is a serial killer. Reader, I am resisting the impulse to beautify the tissue damage. Reader, there is nothing beautiful about this. Reader, am I even a good poet at this point? Reader, this man told me riddles surpass time because they're not convoluted by men. Tell me, reader, do you believe this? Reader, my father told me he loved me today. Reader, what happens if I don't say it back? Thank you.
My gosh, Brittany, wow. That was an incredible, stunning reading. Thank you so much for your words. That was an amazing way to conclude today. And thank you again to José and Nile, and also to the team at Storefront for helping us prepare for today. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, as well as for supporting our archive, which is on the Rails YouTube channel and where this conversation will be posted soon. For the past 23 years, the Brooklyn Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics in our free monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Check the chat for a link to donate to support the work that we do here at the Rail. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Laura Anderson Barbata and Dan Cameron on the event Singing Leaf at Marlborough, New York. We will conclude with a reading by Melina Casados. Thank you all for tuning in today, and you can turn on your microphone and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. What a beautiful
you so
program. Thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
Reader.
Thank
That was so
you, everyone.
great.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And go see Alana
Thank you.
Harris Babu.
Yes, please come to visit us.
Yes, please. Bye,
Absolutely.
everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Thank